assume that this is working. So this is an introduction to Darwin, to the Descent of Man, a section at least of the Descent of Man that we are going to look at carefully, as precisely as we can for this class. And I would like first of all to try to set up a little bit of context when we talk about Darwin, because Darwin has this strange peculiarity that on the one hand everybody knows the name of Charles Darwin. He is certainly one of the persons most often mentioned when people talk about conflicts between science and religion, for instance. And on the other hand, actually quite few people have read Darwin and know what he really said and what he didn't say. So there is a lot of confusion about Darwin. So I think it is quite important to start by clearing up a little bit the space of confusion, and before getting into a close, detailed analysis of what Darwin has to say in a section of the Descent of Man. Okay, the chronology is pretty general chronology, at least, is pretty obvious. Darwin is a man of the 19th century. He was born in 1809 and he died in 1882. And British, of course, as you probably know. I think that the first question we need to ask ourselves is the one of relevance. I always want to start with this question anyway, but what is the relevance of studying this? So, what is the relevance of Darwin in the context of a class called Theories of Human Nature? Well, I think that this is clear, and the answer should be clear. Certainly the question of humanity's origin is probably as old as humanity itself. We see it in old ancient myths of creation, pretty much all over civilizations. You have a myth of creation in Babylonian culture, in Egyptian culture, in the Bible, in Native American stories, in African mythology, where you can see how human beings have this question about where they come from, about their origin. So this is not new. But the idea that the question of our origins could be addressed in scientific terms, that is quite new. It's only in the last few hundred years that this has been raised as a real enterprise, as a scientific question. And when I say scientific, I mean, of course, primarily by means of biology. And with a scientific method that requires, that demands physical evidence to support what it's asserting. Now, where does this come from? Well, this starting point of a scientific approach to the question of human origins is to be found in Darwin. So the relevance of Darwin should be clear. Now, he is the reason why questions concerning human nature and the origin of humanity are raised or can be raised as scientific questions. Now, this started, as you know, in the publication in 1859 of The Origin of Species, a huge book in which Darwin outlines his theory of evolution by natural selection. This gigantic work, Origin of Species, was itself the result of something like 20 years of gestation, of research, gathering evidence, taking notes, among other things, a 3-year trip on a beagle in South America, in the Galapagos. Darwin's visit to the Galapagos, that was probably an important event in the development of his thinking. Strange thing though about the Origin of Species is that although the book is huge, it actually very carefully avoids mentioning human being. Although it implicitly suggests that what he's talking about in the origin applies as well to human beings as the other species he's talking about. But this is not stated carefully, this explicitly. This is not made explicitly known. There's just one sentence in the introduction of The Origin of Species where Darwin famously says that what he's writing here will cast some light on the question of humanity, but then the rest of the book is silent about this. Now, that caused growing controversies. As you know, there was a sort of battle already in the 19th century around the question of Darwinian explanation or evolutionary explanation of humanity. And it led Darwin to outline his theory explicitly, more explicitly, later on, right? Because the controversy were such that people were really asking Darwin over and over and over to please let us make public your views about humanity. Which he did eventually in 1871 with another huge book called The Descent of Man. Now, so if you want to talk about Darwinian view or Darwin's view about humanity, about human nature, about the origin of humanity, then the text you have to look at is not The Origin of Species, it's The Descent of Man. Now, back to the previous point I was suggesting, why does it matter? Well, it matters because with Darwin, the religious explanations of life begins to fade, at least for the most educated people. And in Europe, for instance, at the present situation, the debate between creationists and evolutionists is pretty much regarded as a backward debate that belongs to the 19th century. It's a thing of the past. In the US, it's still very much on the agenda of some people, let's say. The opposition, by the way, if you want to look into this, is that on a certain reading of the Bible, God created the world and the animals, and then separately, God created man. The scientific view, contemporary scientific view, if you want to put it in a nutshell, is that the universe came into being by inner processes in a Big Bang, and that billions of years later, on a somewhat insignificant planet at the edge of a galaxy, some creatures crawled out of the primordial ocean and grew into all the animals that we know, including humans. So that actually, despite the fact that there's a diversity of species, obviously, and there is one life, in a sense, that specializes itself in a multiplicity of forms, and that we are one of the expressions of the many possible expressions of this force of life. Now, one of the main arguments of the creationists, and you must have heard it, and still used over and over, is, oh, you know, evolution is just a theory. And they mean by theory a story. Right? In their minds, theory equals story. Well, in a sense, I would agree. In a sense that the difference is not so great between believing in divine creation because that's the way you were raised by your parents or by the minister that you saw who taught Sunday school, and someone who will be believing in evolution because something, because this person was raised by scientific inclined parents, and this is what the teacher was telling them at school. In those terms, you have a belief, you have another belief. People believe something because they are influenced by psychological factors. People believe something in the other side because they are equally influenced by psychological factors. In both cases, you are just thinking in terms of accepting authority, an authority figure. Right? your parents, teacher, a priest, a rabbi, something like this. Some authority figure that you accept because for some reason you want to please him or her. The problem is that this has nothing to do with science. The difference arises when we are asked to justify and explain the correctness of a theory. So to say that Genesis counts as evidence depends on the prior acceptation of its authority. As you say, on the belief that this is written in some way by God, right? This is God talking to us. And this is what is meant by evidence in this case. If, on the other hand, we explain evolution by scientific means, we seek evidence, same word, evidence, but it means something else. It means evidence in a sense that's something that can be checked and rechecked. Think about evidence in the sense of evidence in a crime scene, for instance, right? Where an evidence would be a footprint, for instance, a spot of blood somewhere, a fingerprint, disturbed furniture in a room where the crime could have happened. That's what they mean by evidence, right? Not testimony of a book that is allegedly of higher authority, but something that can be checked and rechecked. That marks the core difference between a belief system and an inquiry based on geological fossil records. These two don't speak the same language. In that sense, the debate is in a sense not even really a debate between creationism and evolutionary theory. What counts as evidence on each side of the dispute means something fundamentally different. The words of the Bible is evidence for the creationist, while for the scientific view, evidence means something that can be tested and corroborated. Notice consequence. From scientific standpoint, should new facts surface, indeed the theory would either have to account for them or be modified. Now, I'd like to clear up two misconceptions about Darwin. Popular misconceptions about Darwin. First of all, and connected with what I was just talking about, people often think that Darwin must have been some kind of dangerous atheist. This is because people hear about a debate between creationism and evolutionary theory, and they think that since the creationists are religious people, those who are defending evolutionary theory must be atheist. Actually, this is not so obvious. Darwin himself became agnostic at the end of his life. Agnostic means that he claims that the question is not knowable. This is the question of God's existence is not something we can know. But for most of his life, Darwin himself was a man of faith. Actually, to the point that when he went to Cambridge as a student, his intention was to become a minister and studied theology for quite a while. So it seems that for at least he changed throughout his life, but for a good part of his life, including as he was working on his main works, his main text, Darwin had faith. Right? He was going to church on Sunday. And he believed in a divine presence in the universe. But he saw Genesis as a symbolic account of something that actually took billions of years to accomplish, not something that really happened in 6 or 7 days. Second point I would like to clarify about possible misconception is that Darwin did not invent the theory of evolution. Actually, the idea that life had evolved on Earth was something in circulation that had been in circulation for a while, since I think the 18th century. and it was relatively well accepted among scientific circles, right? Not by everyone, but by people who belong to scientific circles of the 18th century. That was already the case. Cuvier, a French scientist, created what is known as paleontology. Paleontology is the study of fossils. And clearly Cuvier understood this as meaning those are traces and testimonies and evidences of forms of life that existed, do not exist anymore, and that those archaic forms of life should be understood as the ancestors of contemporaries forms of lives. Then another scientist named Lamarck, Lamarck, proposed one further step. Lamarck's problem was the following thing. You need to find a method or something that could explain the diversification of forms of life. There's got to be some kind of a process that goes on there. And Lamarck postulated that in order to explain the similarities that you have between animals, for instance, take the family of horses. So you have horses, you have zebras, you have donkeys, okay, and probably a bunch of others, ponies, and a bunch of others that I cannot think of right now. And they all have a sort of family resemblance. There seem to be variation on one pattern. It would be like if you want one blueprint, and then different kind of adaptations and modifications that makes one smaller, the other one bigger, one a bit faster, etc., etc. So Lamarck's idea was that to explain this, the fact that you have those family resemblance, if you want, right? Those larger classes in which we can put a whole group of species together, such as zebra, horses, donkeys. And the existence of fossils of animals that do not exist any longer, we have to assume that actually the animal who doesn't exist any longer was the ancestors, and that somehow the traits that got diversified were carried over by the other generations. The problem is that Lamarck proposed a model which is the inheritance of acquired traits, meaning that if a creature, for instance, needs to develop a certain kind of faculty and does it throughout her life, then the acquired trait is going to be passed down to the next generations, and that little by little by little by little you will have differentiation of species. So it will be a theory of evolution by inheritance of acquired traits, which doesn't seem to work, at least for the most part. The theory that Darwin defended is that of natural selection, which is of course what everybody refers to as the survival of the fittest. So what is the situation now, today? Well, on account of zoological, botanical, geological, and paleontological evidence, in the sense of evidence we were just talking about earlier, we can no longer subscribe to the ideas that species have been created whole and have come through ages unchanged. At this point, all the evidence supports and no evidence disproves that life on Earth has evolved. So let's move on, ladies and gentlemen. Life started out small, and the current state of existence that we observe around us is the result of a process working upon natural materials throughout a period of millions and millions of years. So the question for Darwin concerned the nature of the process. Simply stated, Darwin's theory is that life evolved by natural selection. Currently, biologists agree that biological development can be explained by a combination of two things: genetic mutations in combination with natural selection. In the 19th century, Darwin doesn't know about genes and genetic mutations. Right? So there was a problem for him to explain how you would have transmission of variations to the next generation. That was an objection in the 19th century. It's not an objection anymore, precisely because of genetics. So in its essential parts, Darwin's theory of development has been accepted. In Darwin's time, of course, genetic mutations were unknown, and their discovery led to extensive modification of his theory, but it has also eliminated the most important objection to it.